Dehumanization is the attitude of conceiving of others as less than human creatures. But when you move into this kind of rhetoric, you are in a pre-genocidal condition. If we want to protect ourselves from A, being dehumanizers, and B, being either complicit or actually getting our hands dirty in acts of terrible, unjust violence, we need to understand these processes. We need to understand what it is in the human mind, including the human mind of you and me, that makes us vulnerable to this kind of propaganda.
My guest today is Dr. David Livingstone Smith, a philosophy professor at the University of New England. David's particular area of interest and research is dehumanization and mass violence. He's the author of several award-winning books, which include Less Than Human, Why We Demean, Enslave and Exterminate Others, and On Inhumanity, Dehumanization and How to Resist It. I have previously read these two books and have interviewed David about them just over 2 years ago. I have shared the link to that episode in the show notes, and I highly recommend it for a deep dive on the process of dehumanization more generally. Today, however, David joins me to explore the notion of dehumanization as it applies to the ongoing war between Israel and Hamas. David, welcome back to the Voices of War.
Thank you. It's an honor to be there.
Great to see you, and I know that it's an exceptionally busy time for you, so I really do appreciate you coming back on the show. But just before we dive into, I guess, what's happening in the world at the moment, for those who might not be familiar with your work, how would you describe your academic focus to date, and what led you down this path in the first place?
Okay, so first, let me say that I have a third book on dehumanization now, called Making Monsters: The Uncanny Power of Dehumanization, which is my most comprehensive explanation of my position. So right. What is dehumanization? How did I go down this road? I'm going to invert the two parts of the question. So part of why I went down this road was autobiographical. I grew up in the deep south of the United States in the 50s and 60s, where the dehumanization of African Americans was palpable. And I grew up in an extended family with my maternal grandparents, who were Jewish refugees from Eastern Europe. Their families fled the pogroms, fortunately, decades before National Socialism. So I was marinated in experiences of dehumanization, both in the world around me, in the Deep South, Florida, and in the stories my grandparents would tell about the horrors that were inflicted on Jewish people in Eastern Europe. Now that was sort of latent in my consciousness until 2006. That year, I was working on a book about war and human nature. It was called The Most Dangerous Animal. And when I was researching the penultimate chapter of that book, I came across all of this wartime propaganda representing enemies as subhuman creatures, as vermin or as bloodthirsty predators or whatever. And I thought to myself, oh, this is really very interesting. I should investigate this further. And what I found was there was virtually no literature outside of social psychology. And the social psychological literature I thought was very, very limited, primarily for the following reason. To understand this process, you can't just look inside people's heads. You can't just concentrate on psychology. You have to look at the world in which people's heads are situated. You have to look at the politics, the social forces, and so on. So that's the trajectory that led to my first book on dehumanization, Less Than Human, published in 2011. And I was just trying to figure it out because at that time, there were no books on dehumanization. There was like zero. And
I
still,
remember we laughed at in our last chat. It was one good way to get referenced.
yeah. So my friend
And
Anwar
get cited.
Majid,
Yeah.
a Moroccan colleague, said, David,
Mm,
you've got to write a book on this. Everyone
mm,
will have
mm.
to cite you.
Yeah, that's right.
And still, I think probably I've written half of the books in the English
Yeah,
language
right.
on this topic. So that's how I got to where I am, and it turned out to be uh, a really major task, both to understand the history of the concept of dehumanization and the psychology of how dehumanization works and the political circumstances in which it occurs. So since 2011, my work has been developing. I've corrected some errors that I've made in the past. Presumably, I will correct more errors as the work proceeds. So what is dehumanization? That was the other half of your question. Well, it's not an easy question to answer because the word is used in many different ways to mean many different things. If you Google the word dehumanization, you will get millions of hits. When I last checked, it was around 8 million hits. It's probably much more now. But if you investigate what people are calling dehumanization, it's all over the map. People are using it as sort of a general term for degradation or cruelty or whatever. And even in the academic literature, there are perhaps 10 different conceptions of what dehumanization is. Now, it's not that, some are right and some are wrong. It's just that the word is kind of a funky word that means various things. So if we're trying to do serious work on dehumanization, we need to specify what we mean. And what I mean is the following. Dehumanization is the attitude of conceiving of others as less than human creatures. It's an attitude, so it's in our head, but it's a psychological response, in my view, to political forces. It doesn't arise spontaneously in the human mind. And
Maybe you can develop that a little more because I think
sure,
that will become more relevant as we continue the conversation.
sure.
Yeah.
So if you actually look at the paradigmatic cases of dehumanization, and this is really exemplified in genocide, and I don't know of a single genocide in the last century or so that has not involved dehumanization. If you actually look at these cases, what you see is that dehumanizing beliefs on the part of people who actually get their hands dirty, who do the killing, are prompted by political propaganda. So people in positions of power and authority convince others that these others are subhumans. So it's not that people somehow wake up in the morning and think the Armenians or the Jews or whomever are subhuman beings. They have to have these ideas inculcated in them. And there are certain patterns of propaganda that are very effective in doing that.
So and I think we talked about this at length in our last episode, and I really do encourage people to listen to that for a much more nuanced and deeper dive on these kind of topics. But it is enculturated, as you said, it's part of the environment that you are brought up in, and therefore it needs that political piece, a political justification that will even in the first place motivate why we might other this other social group who is the object of our targeting in whatever capacity.
Yes, so there are always people who have a vested interest in getting us to harm others. to oppress them, to exterminate them, and so on. That's
Mm.
just how things work, unfortunately.
Mm.
And there's a
Yeah.
feature of human culture that is very relevant here. So I think the way to begin this is with an illustration.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm sitting at your listeners can't see this, but they can hear this sound. I'm sitting in front of a desk, and that desk looks to me entirely, without gaps.
Mm-hmm.
But if I were to consult a microphysicist, the microphysicist would say, "Oh, this is mostly empty space, man."
Mm. Mm. Mm.
And I would accept that, even though that's not what my eyes tell me. And I would accept that because I grant the microphysicist a certain kind of authority.
Mm.
Philosophers call this epistemic deference. We defer to the experts. Or now, what's an expert? Well, an expert is
Mm.
someone who's placed in the role of experts. They may not have genuine expertise,
Mm. Mm.
but
Mm.
they're placed in that role. So, in the 30s and 40s, Joseph Goebbels was treated as an expert.
Mm.
Um, so so we accept certain um, claims by experts, even if they contradict our own experience, because the expert is someone who's supposed to know.
Mm.
Now, this is very relevant to dehumanization. So even though these others, the Jews, the Armenians, the Palestinians, whomever is, the flavor of the week,
Mm.
look human, act human, and in fact, as human beings, we cannot help but perceive them as humans. That's just automatic. We're prepared to set that aside in the face of people in positions of authority who tell us, no, they may look human, but they're not really human.
Mm.
They're really
Mm.
something else. They're counterfeit humans. On the inside, there's something alien and dangerous.
Mm.
And
Mm.
these counterfeit humans need to be treated harshly or even exterminated. And
Mm.
I mean, to go further, and later on in the conversation, I could explain why this is.
Mm.
Typically, what
Mm.
occurs is they're seen as demonic, as embodiments of evil. And of course, if you're dealing with a demon, with a monster, with an embodiment of evil, then no treatment is too harsh. And
Yeah.
this leads
Yeah.
to terrible atrocities.
Yeah. Well, there's a moral righteousness. There's a moral weight that comes with that. It's not only the right thing to do, but there's a duty to go and do
Yes,
it.
absolutely. It's
Mm.
obligatory. It's
Mm.
obligatory. And we see this in all of the cases of genocide, right? The
Mm.
genocidaires don't think of themselves as doing something wrong. They think of
Mm.
themselves as saving the world from
Mm.
evil,
Mm.
and it's
Mm.
their obligation, their duty to do
Mm.
these things. And the fact that these acts are hard to commit, that's the fact that people commit them is seen as a measure of their moral fiber.
Yeah,
It's
yeah,
a
yeah.
terrible
That's
thing.
such an important aspect to and to now bring it. And firstly, I just want to highlight the fact that as you mentioned right at the start. I mean, you have a personal history that's connected to Israel, or at least to the Jewish people, and to
Mm.
I guess the atrocities that they have experienced throughout the ages.
Mhm.
So I just want to highlight that because I think it's important to acknowledge it, given the fact that we're going to talk about, what's going on right now in Israel
For
and
sure.
Hamas.
Yeah.
And I also invite you to add any context you wish. I certainly don't expect you to give your position, but if you want to, then feel free to do so. But your expertise on the subject is truly what I find fascinating. It was actually, I believe it was the defense minister, the Israeli defense minister, who used the phrase human animals the first. I think he was the
Yes.
first one to use it in relation to Hamas. totally understandable phrase. Given the circumstances, given the horrors experienced by those Jews in those settlements near Gaza, most people will say, yeah, of course, that's a very fitting phrase. But as soon as I heard that phrase, that was the first moment I remembered our previous discussion, and thought popped into my mind to reach out to you again for a follow-up conversation. Perhaps we can start with that phrase and what your thoughts are on it.
Yeah, so I wrote an essay on that the day it happened, I believe. Well, this is actually a very good segue into getting deeper into dehumanization. So you notice he didn't say these are animals. He said they're human animals. So he didn't say they're wild animals. And he didn't say they're human beings who've done terrible things. He said they're human animals. And that's very, very significant. Because nowadays, and again, I elaborate this most thoroughly in my most recent book, Making Monsters.
And I'll provide the links to that and the essay as well in the show notes.
I think what happens in the most destructive forms of dehumanization is that the other, the dehumanized other, is not simply seen as a predator or an unclean animal, but seen as a strange combination of animal and human. And what that does, actually I should say dangerous animal and human, is it transforms them into monsters. There's no such thing as a being that is totally human and totally animal in the sense that animal is being used there. That's an impossible combination. And it's a combination which is extremely disturbing. When we have two incompatible kinds of things and they're put together, this is the essence of horror. There's an interesting literature on this.
It's the zombie, it's the Frankenstein,
yes,
right? It's
exactly. The zombie is a great example. Zombies are simultaneously alive and dead. That's impossible. And it's a very disturbing notion. Similarly, werewolves are wolves and humans simultaneously. So in expressing himself as he did, what he was in fact doing was representing the other, and he was not clear whether he was referring to Hamas or Palestinians in Gaza generally, or Palestinians generally for that matter. But it doesn't even apply to the fighters in Hamas, right? Monsters don't exist, right?
Yeah,
they are fictional. Human beings commit all these atrocities. There aren't any monsters.
Yeah.
So that struck me as very, very ominous. And in the essay that I wrote on my Substack, I explained all of what I've explained to you just now, and said this bodes ill for Israel's treatment of Gaza. Not too long afterwards, Benjamin Netanyahu described the other, again, he's not specific, as bloodthirsty monsters. So this was really a continuation of the same thing. So this is really, I wrote an essay on that as well. And I said, this is really, really dangerous stuff. I totally understand. I mean, Hamas has committed terrible atrocities, has taken these hostages. God knows what's happened to most of them. Israel has to do something. But when you move into this kind of rhetoric, you are in a pre-genocidal condition. So, I mean, what more can be said? We know what's going on now, what has happened.
Yeah. And just for our audience to set the context, it's gone just after 10 p.m. on the 25th of October, Israel time. Obviously, for you and I, that's very different. You in the US and me in Australia, but it's just to give people an indication of where we are in time and space. As much as this episode will be published rather quickly, but what is the purpose of dehumanization? Because it must have a evolutionary reason. And I'd imagine, perhaps in this instance, these narratives, these phrases, maybe even planned in a way to, desensitize both the Israeli population, but perhaps more importantly, the 360,000 reserves that have been called up, who are all of a sudden, although they're trained, they're reserves. Today they were teachers, tomorrow they're warriors. To, I guess, prepare them for what they might be asked to do. And I'm kind of half answering the question, but it's a loaded question. But maybe you can delve into a bit more detail as to what is the actual evolutionary reason for dehumanizing.
Well, yeah. So, first, I think it's worth noting that some Israelis and some Palestinians, I think we have to be very careful with our words, have both been engaging in dehumanizing propaganda. And, I think the answer to the question, what made these human beings, members of Hamas, capable of committing the atrocities that they did, I would say very likely a dehumanizing representation of Jewish people.
From a very young age.
From a very young age. So Palestinians are marinated in that.
Yeah.
Some Palestinians are.
Yeah.
We need to be very, very careful here. And some Israelis are. And that's a terrible cocktail for violence. So when we talk about the evolutionary function, we have to be very careful there as well. So evolution does come into my analysis, but sort of through the back door. I don't think dehumanization is something that evolution has directly produced in us. What it has produced are psychological dispositions that can be manipulated to get us to dehumanize.
Right, so the us and them, that is the kind
of... Well, it's actually more than that. Right. And it's kind of paradoxical. So here's an uncontroversial fact about Homo sapiens, you and me. Homo sapiens are what biologists call ultra-social animals. Like, there is no other mammal that's as sociable as we are. In place, inhibitions against violence, against community members. Because it's just obvious, isn't it? You can't carry on a social way of life if you're ripping each other's throats out. So these inhibitions, and here's evolution comes into this, have got to be part of the makeup of most of us. There are always exceptions when we're speaking biologically. There are some people who have no inhibitions against violence, but they are the exception rather than the rule. Okay, but we also have these great big brains, and we can recognize that it is advantageous sometimes for us, whatever the us refers to harm, to exploit, to exterminate others, to take their resources, to enslave them, or whatever. So on the one hand, there are these inhibitions against violence, particularly lethal violence. And on the other hand, a recognition that for practical purposes, violence, including lethal violence, can be advantageous to a group. Being the clever primates that we are, over the millennia, we developed various ways of subverting them. And there are many. I mean, there are the use of intoxicants, drugs, alcohol. There's the use of religious ideologies, of mind-altering rituals. And there's the use of dehumanizing propaganda. If we can think of the other as subhuman, dangerously subhuman, monstrous, demonic in particular, then this undercuts the inhibitions that we might feel against doing acts of terrible violence to other members of our species.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this isn't usually, a smooth process because as ultra-social animals, we automatically see human, right? We just can't help it. You look into someone's eyes and you see human. It just clicks in. That, by the way, I think is why killing at a distance is easier than killing close up and personal. Why even in executions, practices like blindfolding or
Yeah.
hooding are used. There's just something terribly difficult and terribly traumatic about looking at a human face and plunging a blade in their gut or blasting them with bullets.
Yeah.
So dehumanization has that property of disabling inhibitions against violence. Now, the propagandists who get us to dehumanize, and propagandist is a little too limited, right? Because sometimes these views are distributed through a culture. I grew up in the Deep South in the 50s and 60s, the idea that Black people were subhuman. I mean, it was just distributed. It's what your people's parents would tell them, and the sheriff and the pastor and so on. But very often it is propagandists uh, that that do this, and sometimes they are sincere. Sometimes they believe it. Sometimes it's cynical. Sometimes it's instrumental. It's a means to get people to do their bidding. So, one of the things that follows from this is that if we want to protect ourselves from A, being dehumanizers, and B, being either complicit or actually getting our hands dirty in acts of terrible, unjust violence, we need to understand these processes. We need to understand what it is in the human mind, including the human mind of you and me, that makes us vulnerable to this kind of propaganda. So we can push back, so we can protect ourselves.
Yeah, because I think that's a really important piece. Because to talk about this propaganda piece now, it seems this particular conflict right now is so globally divisive, right? Where you're globally being forced to, I guess, choose a side. Not being forced. Force is the wrong word, but you're inclined or encouraged to,
Yeah,
and you feels like you're kind of being led down a kind of golden path.
yeah.
How do you view that? Why is this particular area, region, conflict so divisive and so? I mean, all one needs to do is open X or Twitter to see how divisive it is and how quickly it goes down this kind of sliding path to dehumanization.
That's a big question and a hard question, and I fear I can't do it justice, but I'll give you my 2 cents. Um, part of this, but only part, and probably a smallish part, has to do with historical ignorance.
Mm.
This is a very, very complex situation,
Yeah.
and it's not clean, right? The creation of the state of Israel and the two wars that followed. It's the it's very easy to give a cartoonish
Yeah.
representation of of Israelis' struggle for existence in the aftermath of the Holocaust and indeed centuries of genocide. Similarly, it's very easy to give a cartoonish representation of the terrible plight of Palestinians who were ethnically cleansed, which is a euphemism for genocide. Let's be straightforward.
Mm.
From their homes, relegated, particularly in Hamas, to I think sorry, in Gaza, to I think what is appropriately called an open air prison.
Mm.
Um, this is a complex and terrible history where it's not entirely straightforward looking historically who's the good guys and the bad guys. In fact, we should never look at conflicts like that.
Mm. Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
but it's easy to do, and there are people with agendas who like to stir us all up and get us in one position or another. Another very potent um, element here is well, no, before I get on to that, look, fear is motivating.
Mm.
Fear, terror is a predominant emotion on both sides of this. Politicians, particularly authoritarian politicians that want to manipulate our behavior, capitalize on fear. They know what buttons to push,
Mm.
and they push them. And that has certainly gone on in Israel and Palestine. The other point I just wanted to get to, which I preempted myself, is that dehumanization comes very readily if racialization is there first. Now, what do I mean by racialization? Um, that would be a long story. It would be a story for another episode, perhaps.
Mm.
So let me cut to the chase. When we think of others as belonging to a different race, as Israelis, many Israelis and many Palestinians do to one another,
Mm.
we think of them as, first of all, these others as fundamentally different from us, not trivially,
Yeah.
fundamentally, and that
Yeah.
difference is a life sentence, that deep down they're different. We think of them as inheriting that difference from their parents, from their grandparents, and so on. And very crucially, we situate them as beings on a hierarchy. We think of
Mm.
them as inferior. Racialization is the doorway to dehumanization. As I like to put it, dehumanization is race on steroids.
Mm.
And we have this here. So American listeners and probably Australian listeners for different
Mm.
reasons might find this strange. Americans think of race as basically black people and white people.
Mm.
And I would suspect that Australians basically think of race in terms of indigenous Australians versus Euro
Mm.
Australians.
Yeah.
But these are just, socially and historically contingent variations on a
Mm.
broader theme. See,
Mm.
when we racialize people, we demote them in the category of the human. When we dehumanize them, we take it further. Well, they're not really human at all. There's something
They're a human
lower.
animal, right? So that's again, just to use
Exactly.
that as a real
Exactly. The human
poignant
animals.
example. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. That's so powerful. I mean, I think I hope collectively we can start appreciating how powerful words are and how much they, as you rightly say, they motivate. So
Mm.
a phrase like a human animal, that is, as you said, a kind of a demonic creature,
Yeah.
something that needs to be, well, dare I say, exterminated. How
Yeah.
much that incites an emotion, it invokes an emotion, and as you said, fear from the demons, right?
Yeah.
That there's now a whole bunch of emotions rising up, and if a skillful orator can channel that energy into
Absolutely.
destruction,
Yeah.
so into anger, turning it into anger, that then motivates destruction. I mean, that is, I guess, the ultimate goal, one would say, and if it's that is what will allow war to continue or war to start.
Yeah.
And perhaps that, as you rightly pointed out, that's probably what we're seeing right
Yeah,
now.
it is. And war of a particular sort, because you and I know, of course, that inevitably there are atrocities in war. Once you
Mm,
let the demon out of the
mm,
bottle, it's
yeah,
hard to control.
yeah.
But there's war and there's war. right?
Yeah.
And if dehumanization is playing a significant role, all the rules just don't apply,
Yeah.
right? It's anything goes. If you're fighting monsters, anything goes. You there's no, what are the words I want to use? There are
Mm.
no
There's
there's
no
no
limits.
honor.
There's no,
There's no
yeah, no,
honor
yeah,
involved.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah. That's right. Yeah, exactly. There is no honor. That's actually a very good way to put it. Again, from your perspective, and I suspect you're looking at what's going on, perhaps too much through the lens that you're so familiar with. But to what extent does the kind of general media portrayal of both sides contribute to this dehumanization? How do you see? How do you see that play out?
Well, I'm not I'm not sure there is such thing as the general media. There are various media sources, and
Good point.
some of them play explicitly to certain groups of people who already
Mm,
have a vested interest
mm,
in demonizing one side rather than the other. Um, that's dangerous, and it's profoundly objectionable.
yeah, yeah.
Now, I'm a humanist. I think taking these sorts of attitudes, not roundly condemning everyone who does terrible things and not roundly supporting those who are suffering unjustly, is is awful. I mean, it's
Mm,
destructive. It could spell the end to us. I mean, you and I both know how this conflict could lead into something much larger.
mm, mm,
Um, but these are people who are interested in making their own profits and uh, and feeding the flames of bigotry and ignorance. And of course, they have to be allowed to do that, but it's
mm.
paradoxical. Um,
Yeah, yeah.
you know, uh, when the Nazis were rising to power, one of the things that actually Goebbels said was democracy has given us the means for its own destruction,
Mm,
right? We have freedom of speech, and we
mm,
can, by using that, subvert democracy itself. I don't think it's too much of an exaggeration to say that the propagandistic media presentations are subversions of democracy, because
mm,
democracy requires people to be informed, right? It's not just being able to vote, it's being able to understand.
mm.
Um,
How
so,
poignant that Goebbels said that. I mean, it again reminds me of the Hitler's quote. What luck for leaders that men do not think, which
yeah,
again, speaks to that very point. I mean,
that's a good one.
coming from two subject matter experts in the field, as
Mhm.
ludicrous as it is to say that.
Yeah.
What are some of the things that you would say we ought to be we ought to have our eyes open to? I mean, what are some of those things that trigger alarm bells in your mind when you read, hear, see in across the whole media space, whether it's
Yeah.
kind of mainstream or social media or whatever?
Oh, um, I think the weaponization of the Holocaust is a terrible thing. The Holocaust was a terrible thing, but its exploitation in this context, which is very, very different, is awful.
What do you mean?
Well, there's a lot of discourse, particularly, we've seen it from Netanyahu, if I'm not mistaken,
Mm,
comparing Hamas, or maybe Palestinians generally, to Nazis.
mm,
Now, we can condemn Hamas without making a ridiculous claim like that,
mm, mm,
right?
mm. Yeah, because it's a link,
That
right? It's a cognitive link.
it's a
Yeah.
cognitive link, yes, and he knows what he's doing there.
Mm,
Um, so so that's the kind of thing. One example, or one kind of thing we have to be very. You hear something like that, I think you should back up, right? You should
mm,
be prepared to push back because you should know that you're being manipulated. And
Mm,
again, let me be very, very clear. I would be happy with Hamas not existing.
mm, mm,
And there's a sense in which I'm a Zionist, not a
mm,
nasty Zionist,
mm, mm.
but Israel exists. Israelis have a right to live. And just generally speaking, nations are born in violence. So we can't really single out Israel as having some kind of unique history in that respect.
Mm, mm,
Um, but,
mm,
uh, you know, uh, having said that and having condemned Hamas, the position of Palestinians who are trying to get on with their life and like all human beings want basic securities and comforts and to be treated justly is a terrible thing. And I think apart from those who benefit from creating conflict, from
mm.
feeding the flames of violence, there are a lot of people who would just be really happy to live their lives, to live
Yeah,
their lives together.
yeah.
Um, so, so alluding to focusing on the historical injustices doesn't help us deal with a real and present problem and to create a better future. So we need to, I think, look at what's going on now and think about what kind of world we want to create. And so I guess it's a long-winded way of saying when people start playing on these historical injustices, of which there are plenty, and they shouldn't be swept under the carpet,
Mm.
but they are secondary to dealing with present day problems. Right? That's
Yeah,
one thing.
yeah.
But more directly linked to my work, any kind of overtly or covertly dehumanizing rhetoric should ring alarm bells. If people are called human animals, if they're called monsters, if they're or they're indirectly represented like that, talking they're swarming or they're
Mm,
breeding or
mm.
you know politicians sometimes use this kind of language because it's plausibly deniable, but the listeners connect the dots,
Yeah.
right?
And often non-consciously, right? I mean, it's not something that.
Exactly. They don't know what's happening, but they
Mm,
find themselves in a certain kind of state of mind.
mm,
So what's it's really important to get an understanding of how this kind of rhetoric works, so you can engage really in self-defense, in
mm.
moral self-defense,
Yeah.
because it is so easy to get sucked into.
Mm,
I mean,
mm, mm,
imagine if you're an Israeli and members of your family had been brutally killed, and then you are a recipient of this sort of propaganda. Well, it's
mm.
very hard not to get sucked in, but it's
Yeah.
vital that we don't get sucked in
Well,
if
it
we
gives
want
your
to.
rage a space to shine and
Exactly.
exist, right? And even
Exactly.
language immediately after the 7th of October, the language was about vengeance
Yeah.
and revenge, which
Yeah.
again gives space for those emotions to be to vent and
Absolutely.
exist.
Absolutely. And that's another thing, actually.
Mm,
Vengeance is very tempting.
mm,
Something about us. I guess it's the idea we can somehow undo what has happened by doing something
mm.
similar, but vengeance doesn't help.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Vengeance just creates an
Well,
endless cycle of
yeah.
problems.
And again, just to also take it to the, I guess, Palestinian side as well. I mean, as you mentioned earlier, being marinated in this. I mean, this is now generational marination of
Yeah,
hatred and
yeah,
disdain for, firstly, Jews, but then
yeah,
especially for Zionists or the kind of
yeah.
far right Zionists who are
Hmm.
then, then you see through rhetoric of Hamas and Iran that the state of Israel shall not exist. Jews
Yeah.
shall not exist. So these are the kind of
Exterminationism. Yeah.
grand narratives, and it would be so hard. And it was something I spoke with my recent my most recent guest, Chris Gunness, where he was talking about the fifth war in Gaza, that there are now 18, 19-year-olds. That's all they've known. That's all they've known. So it's very difficult for anybody to expect of them to not be
of course
radicalized to the point of, strapping on a suicide vest and marching.
Of course.
Because of that marination, that's all you see, that's all you hear, that's all you know.
And so why should you think differently? Why should you even be able to imagine a different kind of world? Of course you don't. Our horizons are inevitably constrained in these sorts of ways. Now, you mentioned something very, very important, which pertains to racialization. Just as there is indiscriminate violence, say in the West Bank now, against Palestinians. It's not Hamas, it's Palestinians. The anti-Zionist rhetoric has expanded into anti-Jewish rhetoric. So there's again a racialization element involved.
Such an easy step to make, right? It's such an easy cognitive leap to make. It is.
That's right. But then, so the Islamic State has called for attacks on Jews everywhere in the United States and in Europe. My most recent Substack essay is about white supremacists, neo-Nazis in the United States applauding Hamas, which is entirely understandable given their ideology that Jews are enemies number one. And the fact that Jewish people in the United States are really overrepresented in Palestinian rights movements, it doesn't make any difference. When racial notions come to play, it doesn't make any difference. They're all the same, and they all need to be wiped out. So as soon as people start talking that way, I say, man, get off the bus, no matter how tempting it is. Get off the bus.
Yeah, and I think you saw that, maybe that's an example of it, where I've just recently seen on X, a bunch of images of, of Jews in American politics. But it's the Israeli flag next to their name. Which again is there's again a play or kind of a racialization is being kind of smuggled in, or Zionism is being smuggled in, just because somebody might be of Jewish descent or identifies as being Jewish, doesn't automatically equate to them deserving or wanting the Israeli flag next to their name,
not at
right?
all.
Or being Zionist in that instance.
That's right.
And again, that's it's kind of smuggling in this mixture, where one equals the other.
So one of the things that has really interested me and depressed me in writing my most recent book, one of the chapters is on the history of anti-Semitism. And anti-Semitism is so foundational to European culture. It's there in the basement, that it is remarkably robust. Views that were formed, say, in the 13th century, still with us. There are periods where they were latent. It just takes a crisis and bang, they're back. It's like lighting a match to kindling. And that's also a very important component here. Because these things are just so, I'm speaking specifically about anti-Semitism now, so embedded, so basic to European Christian culture, and comparably to Muslim culture, somewhat differently, but still the Jews as treacherous and so on. We have that, particularly in the Hadiths. It makes it again very easy to kind of slide into this way of thinking. People, there needs to be a self-defense manual here. We need to know how to protect ourselves if we're really concerned with combating suffering and making the world a much better place than it has been.
And you also see that jump very easily, very quickly on protests for both sides.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it goes with a well-meaning stop the killing of civilians, and majority of the people, you know, will march for that reason, right? Just don't, you know, stop killing innocents.
Yeah.
But all that's necessary in that mass hysteria, dare I say, is for one chant to come up, and there's a natural tendency for people to join in.
Absolutely.
Even though they might not at all identify with that chant. And that's part of that kind of social psyche, that social kind of sense of belonging of us, of and anybody that's stood up to sing for a national anthem in a stadium knows exactly the feeling I'm describing. It's that kind of the kind of tingles up your spine, the sense of us, of togetherness.
Yeah.
Anything happens.
Anything
can
happen.
happen.
Religious sentiment. You're
well,
people feel they're part of something greater and good. It's very, very seductive.
And it can run off on you so quickly. I mean, we see it in, you know, then of course subsequent violence that might happen, you know, on any of these types of things. Absolutely scary. David, I'm conscious of our time. I know that we've already gone over our agreed designated time. But is there anything that you're seeing or hearing or reading that gives you some hope about this situation, that we might get out of it? That's a horrible way to minimize what's already happened, but to prevent this from going down a path of no return.
I like to say that I'm hopeful but not optimistic. Hopeful, by hopeful I mean that I wouldn't be writing the books that I write and giving the talks that I talk and having conversations like we've had if I didn't think there was some point, if I didn't think there could be a better future, both for the residents of Israel-Palestine and for the residents of the rest of the world. Because, you know, what's going on there is a microcosm of, in certain respects, of what's going on in Ukraine and what's going on in what has been going on in Ethiopia and what's going on in Sudan and so on. I mean, it has the limelight, but there are terrible things going on all over the world. And I do think we can make it better. Whether people will attend to what's required to make it better I'm not that optimistic about. The seductions of revenge and the ease with which we dehumanize and so on are countervailing factors. But hey, we got to keep pushing. And pitching and getting people with real platforms, you know, who are positioned in a way that I'm not and you're not, to influence public opinion. That's what we need.
And peel back some of the veneer or the kind of the fog that's in front of our eyes. That's so it is so simple. And why wouldn't you embrace it when it's such a simple narrative? We're the good guys, they're the bad guys. Full stop. Let's move on and solve this problem. But that, of course, is not how these problems are solved. On that note, David, thank you so much once again for giving me so much of your time. As last time, you have a very unique way of speaking and a calm way of speaking. I'm very envious and jealous of your students because of the way you narrate these important topics and bring them into our mind. At least for me, I keep saying I'm a visual learner. This really helps draw in my mind what you're trying to say. So thanks again and for this, I think, very important discussion.
Well, thank you, Maz. And I think what you're doing on the podcast is a wonderful thing.
Thank you very much.
And I really appreciate the opportunity to have this conversation with you.
Thanks a lot. We'll be in touch. Thank you for listening to another episode of The Voices of War. And since you got this far, please take a moment to like and review the show wherever you get your pods. Thank you, and until the next time. Thank you for listening to another episode of The Voices of War. And since you got this far, please take a moment to like and review the show wherever you get your pods. Thank you, and until the next time.